My name is Emily Carter, and I was 30 years old when I realized that my father would rather break me than ever admit he was wrong. It happened on an ordinary Sunday evening in our family dining room, the same room where I had sat for years in forced silence, as my father controlled every conversation. That night, he snapped in a way that left me with scars no one could deny. I had dared to question him about a small detail, something so trivial that a normal family might have laughed it off, but in our home, nothing was trivial if it challenged Robert Carter's authority. The clatter of silverware had barely faded when his chair scraped back with a violent screech against the wooden floor. His face turned crimson, veins bulging at his temple, and before I could push away from the table, he grabbed the nearest chair and hurled it across the room. It crashed into my shoulder with a force that sent me spinning sideways. My head hit the edge of the buffet cabinet and then the floor with a sickening thud. For a moment, I could not breathe. Pain exploded through my skull like fireworks. The room blurred. My ears rang. I tasted blood. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, and I could see the horrified yet frozen faces of my mother and my younger brother. Linda Carter. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips but said nothing. Jason, my brother, shifted uncomfortably but did not move to help me. Their silence was louder than the crash of the chair. I lay gasping, every breath a struggle, while my father towered above me. He did not reach down. He did not apologize. Instead, he sneered as if I had somehow caused the violence by existing. His voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "You did this to yourself, Emily. You lied again. You always lie to make me look bad." The words burned worse than the physical pain. My mind screamed for someone to defend me, but my family remained still. My mother whispered almost to herself, "Robert, please." But it was not a plea to stop. It was a plea for him to lower his voice so the neighbors would not hear. My brother muttered something under his breath that sounded like she should not have provoked him. I realized then that I was alone in a room full of people who claimed to love me. My father's shadow stretched across the floor as he leaned closer. "If you tell anyone, no one will believe you. You have always been the problem." His tone was cold, calculated, the voice of a man who had practiced intimidation for decades. Tears blurred my vision. I tried to push myself up, but nausea rolled over me. My stomach lurched and I collapsed back down, trembling. The pain in my head was not like the normal headaches I had endured before. It was deeper, heavier, as if something inside my skull was swelling. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight and weak. My body was betraying me, and my own family was watching without lifting a finger. I remember the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second stretching like an eternity. My father turned away and calmly returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. He picked up his fork and knife and resumed eating his steak. My mother glanced at him and then looked down at her plate, chewing mechanically. Jason reached for the salt and avoided my eyes. In that moment, I understood that the chair was not the weapon. Silence was. Their silence told me that this was acceptable. Their silence told me I deserved it. Their silence told me that I was utterly alone. As darkness edged my vision, one thought anchored itself in my fading consciousness. If I survived this, I would never let his truth bury mine again. Growing up as the daughter of Robert Carter meant learning early that love came with conditions and that conditions were always shifting depending on his mood. My earliest memory is not of laughter or lullabies, but of silence so thick I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house settling under my father's watchful eyes. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, barely 6 years old, with a bowl of cereal in front of me. I had dared to ask if I could watch cartoons before finishing my homework, and my father's hand had slammed down so hard that the spoon jumped from the bowl, spilling milk across the table. He looked at me with fury that no child should ever see, and hissed that discipline was love, and I should be grateful he was raising me correctly. From then on, every day became a careful performance. One wrong glance or misplaced word enough to ignite his wrath. My mother Linda was always nearby but never intervened. She would murmur excuses, telling me he only wanted the best for me, but her eyes never met mine. She had learned her own survival meant siding with him, and I learned mine meant shrinking into myself. My brother Jason was born when I was 5, and he quickly became the golden child. He laughed at my father's jokes, fetched his slippers, and mirrored his mannerisms until Robert saw him as an extension of himself. Where I was criticized for being disobedient or lazy, Jason was praised for being respectful and smart. At school, teachers would compliment my grades, calling me bright and hardworking, but at home, my father dismissed it all, saying I was only pretending to be smart to get attention. If I came home with an A, he asked why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he reminded me it was meaningless compared to what Jason would accomplish someday. Every small joy I tried to share was met with criticism or silence. By the time I was a teenager, I had become an expert at masking pain. Outwardly, I looked like a quiet, studious girl, but inside I carried the bruises of endless lecture slaps across the face when I dared to argue, and the sting of a belt across my legs when he decided I was lying. The lies he accused me of were rarely lies at all. They were moments when my truth did not match his version of reality. If I said I was tired, he said I was lazy. If I said I was hurt, he said I was dramatic. If I cried, he said I was manipulating. Slowly, I began to doubt myself, to wonder if maybe he was right and I really was broken in some way that only he could see. But part of me held on to the conviction that I was not the problem, that something in his cruelty was wrong, and I needed to escape. When I finally left for college at 18, I thought freedom had arrived. I moved into a small dorm room 2 hours away and breathed deeply for the first time. Yet Robert's shadow followed me. He called every day, demanding updates, wanting to know who I spent time with, what classes I was taking, and when I planned to visit home. If I did not answer immediately, he would leave angry voicemails accusing me of ignoring him, of betraying the family that paid for my education. Linda's voice appeared on the line, too softer but equally controlling. She said I should not upset him, that he worked hard for us, that a good daughter respected her father's sacrifices. Jason rarely called, but when he did, it was to remind me that Dad thought I was wasting time and money. I tried to build a life separate from them. I studied nursing, drawn to the idea of helping people heal, perhaps because I had never known healing myself. I took part-time jobs to reduce my dependence on their money waiting tables late into the night, folding clothes at the campus store on weekends. The independence thrilled me, but also made me a target for more criticism. Robert scoffed that I was just playing pretend at adulthood. Linda worried aloud that I would embarrass the family. Their voices echoed in my head, even when I was far away. I began to live a double life. To my classmates and professors, I was capable and ambitious. At home, during breaks, I reverted to a quiet shadow, enduring long dinners where Robert quizzed me about my choices and laughed when I tried to defend them. The year I graduated, he refused to attend the ceremony, claiming he was too busy. Linda sent me a text that read, "Congratulations," but Jason later told me they both said nursing was just glorified babysitting. Their disapproval hurt, but I had learned to smile through it. After graduation, I rented a small apartment downtown and took a job at the hospital. My coworkers saw me as reliable and hardworking, and for the first time, I felt respected. Yet at home, I was still the failure. Robert often reminded me that Jason was applying for law school, that he would carry the family name forward with pride while I wasted my potential. Any small success I shared was diminished. Even when I bought my own used car, Robert sneered that it would break down in a month. When I mentioned saving for better furniture, he laughed that I could barely hold a job long enough to pay rent. His words lodged deep, turning every step forward into a battlefield against his voice in my head. I dated briefly, but Robert's influence seeped in. He interrogated me about every relationship, demanded to meet boyfriends, and warned them that I was unstable. Most men left quickly, unwilling to deal with the shadow of my father. I began to believe I was unworthy of love, that his assessment of me as manipulative and difficult might be true. The only place I felt a spark of worth was at the hospital, where patients thanked me for kindness and doctors praised my diligence. Still, I carried my family's judgment like a weight, returning for dinners that always ended in arguments or silent condemnation. The night he hit me with the chair was not an isolated event, but the culmination of decades of control and violence. That chair carried the weight of every belt, every slap, every cruel word. It carried the weight of silence from my mother and complicity from my brother, and it carried the weight of my own fear that maybe, just maybe, I had always been the problem. Yet as I lay on that floor, the ringing in my ears drowning out his accusations, something inside me shifted. I realized that my entire life had been spent shrinking to fit into the shape he demanded, and the chair had finally broken that shape. The pain was unbearable, but it also forced me to see that if I survived, I could no longer live under his rule. That night was not just another beating. It was a turning point. It was the beginning of my refusal to be silent. The morning after the chair attack, I woke up in the hospital with my head wrapped in bandages and the beeping of machines around me. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nose, and for a moment I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But when I tried to sit up, pain ripped through my skull, and the memory of my father standing over me came flooding back. A nurse entered softly and told me to lie still. She explained that my injuries were serious and the doctors wanted to run more tests. I asked if anyone had been by to see me, and she hesitated before answering that my family was in the waiting room. A knot formed in my chest. I wanted comfort, but deep down, I knew what awaited me was not comfort, but control. When they finally came in, my father led the way, looking composed as if nothing unusual had happened. He asked the nurse to give us a moment, and once she left, he leaned over my bed. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but I knew it was the calm before the storm. "You slipped, Emily," he said. "You hit your head when you fell. That is what happened." I tried to protest, but my mother quickly interjected. "Robert, please let us not upset her." Then she looked at me, and her eyes pleaded not for my safety, but for my silence. Jason stood in the corner, arms folded, avoiding my gaze. My father continued, "If you tell anyone something different, if you tell them I hit you, you will ruin this family. Everyone knows you are dramatic. Everyone knows you twist the truth. No one will believe you." His words felt like a chain tightening around my chest. I wanted to scream the truth, but the weight of their eyes silenced me. My mother reached for my hand, but her grip was limp. She whispered, "Emily, you need to rest. Just listen to your father." Jason finally spoke, his voice low. "She should not have provoked you, Dad." The betrayal cut deep. I realized they had already agreed on the story. They would all insist I had fallen, that my injuries were my own fault. My truth would be drowned in their chorus of lies. Later that day, a police officer came to take a statement. My father spoke for me before I could open my mouth. "She tripped," he said firmly. "She has always been clumsy. She got dizzy and fell against the cabinet." The officer looked at me for confirmation, and my father's eyes drilled into mine, daring me to contradict him. My throat tightened and fear won. I nodded weakly, ashamed at my own silence. The officer scribbled notes and left satisfied. My father smirked. "See, he believes me. He always will." My mother patted my arm as if I were a child needing comfort after a tantrum. Jason left without a word. Alone again, tears streamed down my face. That was the cruel genius of gaslighting. It made me doubt my own reality. Maybe I had provoked him. Maybe I was dramatic. Maybe I was the problem. The voices of my family were louder than the throb of pain in my head. Days passed in a haze of medication and whispered arguments in the hallway. I overheard my father telling the staff that I had a history of instability, that I had seen therapists, that I often exaggerated symptoms. He painted me as unreliable, and I could see the subtle shift in how some nurses looked at me. Doubt was contagious. At night, I lay awake listening to the beep of the monitor and the quiet footsteps outside. I wondered if I should just accept their version of the story. It would be easier. No conflict, no fighting, just survival as always. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chair flying through the air, felt the crack of my skull against the cabinet, and I knew the truth was carved into my body whether they admitted it or not. One evening, my father returned alone. He sat beside my bed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can fight me, Emily. You think you can make people believe your lies. But I am respected in this community. I have friends who will swear by my character. You have nothing but your overactive imagination. If you try to go against me, I will destroy you." His words chilled me more than the cold air of the hospital room. I lay still, pretending to be weak, but inside, something was stirring. I was tired of being silenced. The pain in my head was real, the bruises on my body were real, and one day soon I would have proof. For now, I let him believe he had won. When the doctor came in the next morning, he frowned at my chart and asked more questions. He seemed unconvinced by the story of a simple fall. He ordered an MRI, saying he wanted to check for internal damage. My father objected, saying it was unnecessary, but the doctor insisted. Robert's face tightened, but he said nothing. As the machine hummed around me during the scan, I closed my eyes and prayed that the images would finally speak louder than his lies. In the meantime, my father spread his story wider. Neighbors visited, and he told them I had fainted. My mother repeated the tale with nervous smiles. Jason added that I had been working too hard at the hospital and probably collapsed from exhaustion. Everywhere I turned, the narrative was fixed. I was the unreliable one, the unstable one, the liar. Their words seeped into every corner of my world until I felt suffocated. Yet amid that suffocation, I held on to the faint glimmer of hope that the MRI would reveal the truth. The days between the scan and the results were torture. My father's confidence grew his smirk, a constant reminder of his power. My mother fussed over me with empty gestures, but never once asked how I felt. Jason visited once bringing a magazine, but his eyes never met mine. They acted like a jury who had already decided the verdict, and in their eyes, I was guilty of being untrustworthy. I began to prepare myself for the possibility that the MRI would show nothing, that the world would accept their version forever. That fear gnawed at me, but the pain in my skull told me something was wrong. It was not normal, it was not exaggerated, it was real. And if the MRI proved it, then for the first time in my life, I would have something undeniable, something they could not twist. I promised myself that if the evidence came, I would not stay silent again. I would stand in the light of truth, no matter how much they tried to bury me. The morning the MRI results came back, the air in the hospital room felt heavier than usual. I sat propped against the pillows, my head throbbing in dull waves, while my mother fussed with the blanket and my father paced near the window. Jason scrolled silently through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I could sense the tension in my father's stiff posture. He had worked tirelessly to spread his version of the story, but the doctor's insistence on further tests unsettled him. When Dr. Miller entered the room with a folder tucked under his arm, all eyes turned to him. He greeted me first, not my father, and asked how I felt. I murmured that my head hurt constantly, that dizziness and nausea still struck at odd times. He nodded gravely. Then he opened the folder. "The MRI revealed bleeding inside your skull," he said in a steady voice. "You have a brain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, the room went silent, then my father barked a laugh. "That is ridiculous," he said. "She fell. Everyone knows that." Dr. Miller's gaze did not waver. "Mr. Carter," he replied calmly, "these injuries are not consistent with a simple fall. They required significant external force. This was not an accident." My heart pounded in my chest. Finally, someone was saying the truth out loud. My mother gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth. Jason shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about Emily being clumsy, but the doctor continued cutting through their weak denials. "I have seen hundreds of cases like this," he said. "The pattern of injury does not match the explanation you have provided. I will be documenting my findings thoroughly." My father's face turned red with fury. He pointed at me and spat the words. "She is lying. She has always lied. She probably injured herself to make me look bad." Dr. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Sir, you cannot injure yourself in this manner. The hemorrhage is deep, and the force required would not come from someone deliberately hurting themselves. This is serious. She could have died." At that, my stomach clenched. I realized just how close I had been to never waking up again. My mother whispered Robert, please, but he silenced her with a glare. He stormed toward the door, muttering about doctors who did not know what they were talking about. Jason followed his face pale. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of power. The truth was written in black and white on the images of my brain. No matter what they said, the evidence stood against them. Doctor Miller stayed by my side. "You need to rest and you need protection," he said. "I will be filing a mandatory report. Domestic violence of this magnitude cannot be ignored." I looked at him with tears streaming down my cheeks. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded solemnly. That day, the narrative began to shift. Nurses who had looked at me with suspicion now treated me gently, whispering that I was brave. A social worker came to my room, asking questions, assuring me that I was not alone. Still, my father did not give up. He began to tell anyone who would listen that the doctor was mistaken, that modern medicine was unreliable, that I had manipulated the staff. He tried to bully the hospital administration, threatening lawsuits and demanding another opinion, but every additional scan confirmed the same thing: blunt force trauma, brain hemorrhage, evidence that could not be twisted. My mother came to see me alone one evening. Her eyes darted nervously as she sat at the edge of my bed. "Emily, you know your father never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "He just loses his temper. If you press charges, if you speak out, you will destroy this family." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Destroy this family," I repeated. "He nearly destroyed me." She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. For her, the family's reputation mattered more than my survival. Jason visited the next day and muttered similar words. "You should just let it go," he said. "Dad is respected. No one will believe you." But I no longer trembled at their voices. I had the MRI. I had the truth. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived quickly. I was wheeled into the courtroom, still weak from my injuries, but inside I carried a determination stronger than anything my father had ever instilled in me. Robert sat across the room, confident as always, dressed sharply, his lawyer by his side. My mother sat behind him, pale and tense. Jason whispered encouragements to their father, not to me. The proceedings began, and my father's lawyer painted a picture of me as unstable, prone to exaggeration, and resentful. He claimed I fabricated stories to gain sympathy. I sat silently, hands folded, letting him spew his lies. When it was my turn, I spoke clearly. I was injured by my father when he threw a chair at me. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Robert slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Liar!" The judge silenced him with a sharp reprimand. Then my lawyer called Dr. Miller to the stand. He testified with authority, explaining the MRI images in detail. He described the bleeding, the fractures, the unmistakable evidence of external force. He concluded firmly that my injuries could not be self-inflicted and could not be from a minor fall. The weight of science filled the room. My father's confidence faltered. He shouted again, accusing the doctor of bias, but the judge's expression darkened. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The twist had arrived. The narrative he had controlled for decades was collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. My mother's shoulders slumped. Jason stared at the floor, and the gallery murmured with disbelief. I felt a surge of vindication. The MRI had given me back my voice. It had torn through the years of silence and lies. In that moment, I was no longer the fragile daughter who cowered under his control. I was a survivor armed with truth. The proceedings ended with the judge ordering further investigation and protective measures for me. My father was restrained from contacting me. The look on his face as the order was read was a mixture of rage and humiliation. He was no longer untouchable. He was exposed. I sat in my wheelchair, weak but unbroken, and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning." The day of the full hearing arrived like a storm I had been anticipating my entire life. Weeks of medical recovery had left me frail, but my determination had only sharpened. The courtroom was crowded not only with legal professionals, but with neighbors, acquaintances, and colleagues who had heard fragments of the story. My father, Robert, entered first, his head held high, wearing a crisp suit as though appearance could still shield him from the truth. My mother, Linda, walked behind him, her eyes darting nervously, while Jason stuck close, his jaw tight with loyalty to the man who had molded him. I sat on the opposite side, supported by my attorney and Dr. Miller, who had agreed to testify again. Though my body still trembled with the aftershocks of trauma, my voice was steady inside me. This was the moment when silence would end. The judge began the session, calling the case to order. My father's lawyer stood immediately confident, painting me once more as unstable, manipulative, and prone to exaggeration. He claimed I had a history of seeking attention, that I had invented accusations to destroy my father's reputation. He waved old therapy records, snippets of counseling notes, twisting them into proof that I was unreliable. My father sat smugly nodding at every word, his confidence radiating across the room. He believed his performance would drown out the facts, as it always had in our family. But this time, the truth had an advocate stronger than fear. When it was our turn, my attorney calmly laid out the evidence. He projected the MRI scans onto a large screen, and the courtroom gasped as the images of bleeding and fractures appeared. Dr. Miller explained each slide with clinical authority, his voice steady and unwavering. He described the nature of the trauma the force required, the impossibility of it being self-inflicted or caused by a mild fall. He spoke of the danger I had faced, the life-threatening risk. The judge listened intently, taking notes, her eyes narrowing at the contrast between cold science and my father's flimsy narrative. My father erupted, shouting that it was all fabricated. His lawyer tried to rein him in, but Robert's temper betrayed him. He stood and pointed at me. "She is lying. She has always lied. She wants to destroy me." His voice cracked with desperation, and the gallery murmured. The judge banged her gavel and warned him to control himself or be removed. That crack in his armor was the beginning of his unraveling. My attorney then called me to testify. I rose slowly, my legs weak, but my spirit fierce. I spoke of the night of the chair, the years of control, the silence of my mother and brother, the endless cycle of gaslighting. My voice shook at times, but I forced myself to continue recounting every detail with precision. I told them how I had felt, the chair strike me, how the floor had gone black, how I had woken to their lies surrounding me. As I spoke, I saw faces in the crowd shifting from skepticism to outrage. My father's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed me to continue, her gaze fixed on me with a solemn gravity. Then came the moment I had waited for. My attorney presented the mandatory report filed by Dr. Miller, along with statements from nurses who had noted inconsistencies in my father's version of events. The paper trail of truth unfolded across the courtroom piece by piece, dismantling the empire of lies my father had built. My father's composure shattered. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting that I was ungrateful, that I was a disgrace, that I was trying to ruin the family. His voice echoed with the same venom that had filled our home for decades, but this time it was public, undeniable, seen by all. My mother broke down quietly, tears streaking her cheeks, while Jason stared at the floor, his face pale. The gallery erupted in whispers. This was no longer a private family matter. This was a public reckoning. The judge leaned forward and addressed my father directly. "Mr. Carter, your behavior today is deeply concerning." Combined with the medical evidence and witness testimony, the court must take these allegations with utmost seriousness. His mouth opened to argue, but his lawyer pulled him back down, whispering urgently. The sight of Robert Carter silenced, restrained by his own representative, was a sight I had never imagined. My attorney pressed further, asking the court to acknowledge not only the physical violence, but the sustained pattern of psychological abuse. He spoke of the danger of silence, of the way families could become prisons when truth was denied. Every word resonated with me, each syllable a vindication of what I had endured. The judge allowed me to add a closing statement. I stood once more, feeling every eye in the room on me. I said that for years I had believed silence was safer, that keeping the peace meant surviving, but silence had nearly killed me. I explained that my father's violence was not a momentary lapse, but a lifetime of control, gaslighting, and cruelty. I told them that my survival was not just for myself, but for every child, every woman, every victim silenced by fear of not being believed. The room was utterly still. My father squirmed in his seat, sweat glistening at his temple. The judge's expression was firm, her pen poised above her notes. The gavel struck, signaling a recess, but the tension did not dissipate. Outside the courtroom, whispers followed my father, neighbors avoiding his eyes, colleagues shaking their heads. The mighty Robert Carter was being seen for who he truly was. The public revenge was not only in the legal battle but in the collapse of the image he had cultivated. For decades he had worn the mask of respectability, the successful man with a devoted family. But now that mask lay shattered on the courtroom floor. As the day drew to a close, the judge ordered protective measures in my favor, restraining my father from contact, mandating further hearings to determine charges. He was escorted out of the courtroom by officers, his shoulders hunched, his fury visible but impotent. My mother tried to follow, but she was stopped by a reporter who asked bluntly if she knew about the abuse. She stammered her silence louder than any denial. Jason slipped away, unnoticed, his loyalty now a weight he could not carry in public. I sat in my chair exhausted but uplifted. The public had witnessed what I had lived in shadows. The evidence had spoken, the lies had been exposed, and the man who once towered over me with absolute authority now shrank under the gaze of justice. The gallery began to empty, but some people approached me quietly. A nurse whispered that I was brave. A neighbor who had once believed my father's stories said she was sorry for doubting me. Each word was a salve on the wounds of isolation I had carried for so long. Yet the most important moment came when the judge addressed me directly before adjourning. "Miss Carter, your courage today has ensured that the truth could not remain buried. This court will not tolerate violence hidden behind closed doors." The words washed over me like light. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. The public revenge was complete, not through violence or rage, but through truth, evidence, and the courage to stand in the open. My father had tried to bury me under lies, but now he was buried under his own exposure. As I was wheeled from the courtroom, the sun was setting outside, casting a golden glow through the windows. I looked at the sky and felt for the first time in decades that I was free. The verdict came weeks later after further testimony and the weight of evidence had been reviewed. I walked into the courtroom with a steady gait, stronger now the bandages gone, though the ache in my head remained. My father sat across from me, his once commanding presence diminished. He looked thinner, older, the strain of the proceedings etched into his face. Linda sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, while Jason avoided eye contact altogether, staring blankly at the floor. The judge entered her robe, swaying as the gallery rose to its feet. The silence was heavy with anticipation. When she began to speak, her voice carried the authority of the law, but also the weight of morality. "Mr. Carter," she said, "the court has reviewed medical evidence, expert testimony, and the consistent account provided by your daughter. The conclusion is undeniable. You inflicted serious bodily harm upon Emily Carter, resulting in a brain hemorrhage. Your repeated attempts to gaslight her and the corroborating silence of family members demonstrate a pattern of psychological abuse as well." Robert Carter's face twisted in anger, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm, restraining him. The judge continued, "This court cannot and will not allow such acts to be dismissed as family disputes. Violence within the home is still violence. The sentence is probation with mandatory counseling, supervised community service, and strict restraining orders preventing contact with Emily Carter. Violation of these terms will result in immediate incarceration." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My father slumped back in his seat, fury smoldering in his eyes, but for the first time, powerless. The officers approached, handing him documents and escorting him out. He shouted my name, once a bark filled with rage, but it carried no authority anymore. He was a man unmasked, and the world had seen him. My mother remained seated, her body trembling. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet with tears. "Emily, I did not know," she whispered hoarsely, but the truth rang bitter. She had known enough. She had chosen silence, and that silence had nearly cost me my life. Jason mumbled something to our mother and walked quickly out of the courtroom, his loyalty now a shame he could not bear in public. Reporters outside pressed forward with questions. I shielded my eyes from the flashes, speaking only once. "The truth is what saved me," I said. For years, silence protected him, but the truth set me free. That night, the story spread across the community. Neighbors who had believed my father's charm now looked at him differently. His colleagues distanced themselves, whispering that they had never truly known him. The man who once commanded respect now carried the mark of disgrace. Linda became a shadow in the neighborhood. Her grocery trips hurried her conversations brief. Jason faced whispers at work, and among friends, his reputation tainted by his complicity. For me, the consequences were both heavy and liberating. I bore the headaches, the dizzy spells, the knowledge that my brain would carry scars forever. Yet I also bore the strength of having stood in the open, of having claimed justice. The hospital staff treated me differently now, with quiet admiration. Patients who recognized me whispered words of encouragement. Some even confided their own stories of hidden abuse emboldened by mine. The ripple effect was undeniable. One evening, I returned to my apartment alone. I sat in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and I realized how different that silence felt compared to the suffocating quiet of my childhood home. This silence was mine. It did not threaten, it did not accuse, it did not control. It simply existed, peaceful and free. A letter arrived days later, scrawled in my mother's handwriting. It was filled with apologies, claims that she had been afraid, that she had not known what to do, that she wished she could take it back. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness was not something owed. Betrayal had consequences, and some wounds could not be undone by words. Jason sent no message, no apology. His silence now was different from before. It was not loyalty, but shame. And I let it be. The justice had been served not only in the courtroom, but in the shift of perception that surrounded my father. His name no longer carried admiration, but suspicion. His voice no longer silenced me, but revealed him. The power he once wielded with ease had evaporated under the light of truth. For me, the greatest consequence was the freedom to live without his shadow dictating my steps. I no longer feared his outbursts, no longer shrank beneath his words. The court order protected me legally, but more importantly, the exposure protected me emotionally. He could no longer rewrite my reality. He could no longer convince the world that I was unstable, dramatic, or a liar. The evidence had spoken louder than his voice ever could. As weeks passed, I noticed the changes ripple further. Friends who had drifted away returned, offering support. Colleagues admired my resilience. Even strangers who recognized me from court coverage stopped me to say I had given them courage. It was a strange feeling to become a symbol of survival, but it also healed parts of me that had been starved of validation for so long. Yet there was also grief. Grief for the family I had never truly had. Grief for the mother who chose fear over love. Grief for the brother who chose loyalty to power over loyalty to truth. Grief for the father who never chose to be a father at all. Justice had been served, but it could not restore what was broken beyond repair. Still, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I was no longer defined by his violence. I was defined by my survival, my courage, and my refusal to stay silent. That was the consequence he had not anticipated. He thought destroying me would secure his control forever. Instead, it exposed him and freed me. The first morning I woke up knowing my father could no longer touch me felt like stepping into a new world. The sunlight through my apartment window seemed sharper, brighter, as if the air itself carried freedom. I touched the faint scar along my hairline, a reminder of the chair that had nearly ended me, and instead of fear, I felt defiance. The scar was no longer a mark of shame, but of survival. I carried it openly, letting the world see what silence had once hidden. In the weeks after the trial, I began to rebuild, piece by piece. I returned to the hospital nervous at first, but my colleagues welcomed me with warmth. Patients smiled when I entered their rooms, some whispering that they had read about me, that I gave them courage. Every kind word stitched together the parts of me that my father had torn apart. Still, there were moments of loneliness. I would glance at my phone, half expecting a message from my mother or brother, but none came. Linda had sent her letter of apology, and I had chosen not to respond. Forgiveness felt like a cheap bandage over a wound that required time and distance to heal. Jason remained silent, avoiding me entirely. Their absence hurt, but I learned that absence was better than betrayal disguised as love. The greatest lesson was understanding that family is not defined by blood alone. Family is those who stand beside you when truth threatens to break you. In the courtroom, I had been supported by strangers, by nurses and doctors who chose honesty over convenience, by a judge who refused to be blinded by appearances. That was family too. I stopped chasing the approval of people who never saw me and began to honor the ones who did. One afternoon, as I walked through the hospital corridor, a little girl held her mother's hand and looked at me with wide eyes. She whispered to her mother, "That's the lady who stood up to her dad." I knelt down, smiling gently despite the lump in my throat. "Yes," I said, "sometimes you have to stand up even when it's hard." The girl nodded, and I realized that my story was bigger than me now. It carried weight for others who still lived in silence. My father's downfall had become a warning, my survival a beacon. At night, I wrote in a journal, spilling memories I had long buried. Each word was a release, each page a reclaiming of the narrative my father had tried to steal. I wrote of the chair, the gaslighting, the silence, but I also wrote of the strength it took to keep breathing, to keep fighting. I promised myself that I would never again let someone else define my reality. I was no longer the little girl shrinking under his shadow. I was Emily Carter, survivor nurse woman, with a voice that could not be silenced. Months later, the restraining order remained in place and Robert lived under the constraints of probation. Reports trickled back to me that he had grown bitter and isolated, his once wide circle of friends dwindling. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried whispers of disgrace. That was a consequence he would carry longer than any sentence. Linda lived in the same house, her presence a ghost of what could have been. She tried occasionally to reach out, but I kept my boundaries firm. She had made her choices. Jason, too, bore his silence, working quietly, but no longer boasting of our family. They had chosen loyalty to power over love, and they had reaped the emptiness of that choice. I chose differently. I chose to live. The lesson was clear. Silence protects only the abuser. Truth, though painful, is the only path to freedom, and freedom once tasted cannot be surrendered. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the city lights shimmer, I felt the weight of the past lift slightly. I whispered to the night a vow for the future. I would help others see that they were not alone, that evidence and truth could break chains. My story was not an end, but a beginning. I knew scars would remain both visible and hidden, but I also knew they did not define me. What defined me was the choice to rise, to speak, to live without fear. The woman who entered that courtroom broken and trembling was not the same woman who walked out. I was reborn in the light of truth. My father had tried to crush me with violence, but in the end he had only revealed my strength. Justice is not only what the court delivers. Sometimes justice is the moment you refuse to be silent, the moment you claim your story, the moment you walk forward unafraid. That was the justice I carried with me every day.